Mr. President, it's been my privilege to represent the people of Montana in Congress now for more than a decade. I have seen Congress wrestle and struggle with many challenges during my time here. I've heard my constituents voice concerns, and deservedly so, about many of them. But by far, one of the worst habits that Congress has is its failure to follow its own budget process. In fact, it's not an understatement to say that the budget process has completely collapsed in both chambers. And I hear about this back home, and rightfully so. Wherever I go in Montana, folks tell me they're tired of the dysfunction here in Congress, and especially its lack of fiscal discipline. For a body that was elected to represent the will of the people, we're doing the exact opposite. This is simply not what our constituents sent us here to do. Too many families in our country living paycheck to paycheck. They're working sometimes multiple jobs to make ends meet. And most importantly, they're sacrificing to do so. When they elect their representatives, they expect good, responsible governing. They expect Congress to operate more like they do when it comes to budgeting and spending and living within their means. Yet year in and year out, Congress does anything but. Let me read you the tale of the tape. The last time Congress enacted all 12 appropriations, you could say it's passing the budgets, but they're called appropriation bills. The last time they met the goal of getting it done by September 30th, the end of the fiscal year of the federal government, was 1997. That's nearly 3 decades ago. And it's not like we wake up on the 1st of January every year and wonder, when are they going to schedule September 30th? When does September 30th going to fall this year? It's not like they surprise us and say, oh, my word, it's September 30th. It's no surprise. 27 consecutive years. Even sadder is how Congress has ignored the Budget Act. The Budget Control Act became law in 1974. This law put into place the modern budget process. It was enacted, ironically, to give Congress more control over federal spending and the budget process. Theoretically, this would give our constituents a stronger say in how their tax dollars are spent. But what has Congress done with that authority? Since the Budget Control Act became law 50 years ago, Congress has been out of control, though the Budget Control Act was passed 50 years ago. Congress rarely even passes a budget resolution anymore, which is supposed to start the budget process every spring. This resolution is supposed to provide a roadmap for how we approach the appropriations process. Without this roadmap, Congress inevitably finds itself in a spending train wreck. And our constituents, by default, have little say in how their tax dollars are spent. That's exactly what has happened year after year after year, 27 consecutive years, in fact. In the past 50 years, since the Budget Control Act was passed, Congress has only enacted all 12 appropriations on time 4 times. 1977, 1989, 1995, and then 1997. Again, back to 97, we will now have a 27-year consecutive losing streak as we will go past September 30th without having the appropriations passed. This year, Senate Democratic leadership hasn't brought a single appropriation bill to the floor, and we're just 12 days from the beginning of the new fiscal year. Continuing resolutions that fund the government at current levels are now the norm. In fact, between 1977 and last year, Congress passed 200 continuing resolutions. 200. And thus, the threat of a government shutdown is always looming. All this forces Congress to fund the government through what we call omnibus appropriations. And for those watching back home, that means instead of giving each appropriator an appropriations bill a hearing and the scrutiny it deserves, most of the spending bills are all lumped together into 1 or 2 giant bills, often thousands of pages long each. No one has time to read the entire bill before we pass it, so it's usually chock full of wasteful spending, pet projects that were inserted literally in the dead of night. Since 1982, Congress has passed 36 omnibus appropriation bills. That's just short of 1 per year. Since that time, Omnibus appropriation bills have served as a legislative vehicle for more than half of the federal government's appropriations. In short, our broken budget process has created an incredible amount of uncertainty. In fact, the only thing that is certain in the whole mess is that this broken process has exacerbated the federal government's out-of-control spending. There's no way to run a household this way or a small business, not to mention the government, and the American people know it. So why is all this important? As I mentioned, Congress doesn't have a revenue problem. It's not a revenue problem. Look at our deficits and our debt. This is not a revenue problem. It is a spending problem, no matter how you look at it. Our failed budget process is not only the cause for the fiscal disaster, it's also playing a very significant role. The last time the government had a budget surplus was 23 years ago, back in 2001. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says that the budget deficit for this year will be around $2 trillion. That's unprecedented. In fact, the deficit over the next decade will now total a staggering $22 trillion. That's the deficit added on top of the current debt. Even more frightening is the fact that Medicare will be broke by 2031, Social Security by 2034. By 2035, CBO estimates that debt held by the public will top $50 trillion and be the equivalent of 122% of our GDP. These are staggering numbers. We can't ignore this crisis. To start the long process of fixing it, we need to start with serious reforms on the budget process. The people of Montana know I'm not a creature of Washington, nor, frankly, do I care to be. I'm not a career politician. I did not work my way up through the ranks of state legislatures. My experience is in the private sector. Anyone who's been to Montana knows that while Montana is the most beautiful state in our country, the strength of our great state lies with its people. We're hard-working folks. They believe in an honest day work for an honest day pay. And they never hesitate to share a good dose of common sense, something that I find severely lacking here in Washington, D.C. Montana common sense, combined with my private sector background, taught me a number of principles that I think we can apply to our budget process. For starters, let's hold members accountable, and performance needs to be scrutinized. When structural failure persists, it's got to be addressed. For that reason, if members of Congress can't pass all 12 appropriation bills on time, suspend their pay. Don't shut down the government, shut down the pay of members of Congress. In fact, shut down their pay, shut down their travel, force them to stay here in Washington, and believe me, this will get resolved rather quickly. Because we all know if you don't do your job, you don't deserve to be paid, especially when the American people are the folks paying us. That would put an end to government shutdowns. And let's be honest, shutting down the government only punishes the American people and increases cost, which is exactly the wrong thing we need to do. But put the pain on Congress, and that will start to change things around here in a hurry. Second, Congress should address all spending, including discretionary and non-discretionary programs. Think about it. Discretionary spending is utterly dysfunctional, and there's virtually no forcing mechanisms to require Congress to actually deal with the autopilot spending that accounts for nearly 70% of federal spending. And avoiding the tough challenge within mandatory spending means our national debt will just continue to soar to new incomprehensible heights, and that puts our kids and our grandchildren on the hook. This will require a bipartisan cooperation to save these programs and future generations. And speaking of bipartisanship, the reforms we make must work, whether we have unified government or divided government. Right now, it's about impossible to pass a bicameral budget during divided government. This just leads to the unwanted, behind closed doors mad dash as the expiration date for the latest continuing resolution approaches. Which leads to my final and maybe my most important point. Any reforms to our broken budget process must be bipartisan. There's always going to be disagreements around how taxpayer dollars should be spent, but we should be able to agree on a workable, durable process to make those decisions. To that end, we need to build on the good work of my late friend and former colleague, the late Senator Mike Enzi from Wyoming. During more than 2 decades serving in the Senate, Mike worked tirelessly on this issue. Many of his proposals deserve a strong look if Congress is ever to find a solution. I believe two deserve particular attention. The first would reorient the budget resolution to a 2-year cycle. That would allow Congress more time to not only develop but also enforce the budget. I also believe Senator Enzi's proposal to create a new special reconciliation process that could only be used for reducing the deficit also warrants consideration. There are many others. I know a number of my colleagues have weighed in on this issue as well. I welcome their ideas. So the question I pose today to members on both sides of the aisle is, when are we going to get serious about addressing this calamity? How many more times are we going to kick the can down the road? How many more shutdowns? How high must our deficits and debt climb before we say enough is enough? Mr. President, I humbly submit today that we did reach that point actually long ago. It is past time to bring the common sense of Montanans to bear on the nation's budget process. Now is the time for serious budget reform. Thank you, Mr. President.